Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. It looks like we got some brand new nerfs coming in hot for the patch 11.2, which was expected. They were going to do some tuning, but I didn't expect they were going to try to shake up the meta this much. And it looks like a meta was starting to solidify over in the PTR before we even were able to dive into Season 3 content, with many of the popular, but also a lot of the overtuned classes getting chopped down by quite a bit, but also anything that was found underperforming getting a lot of love this time around. As you can see, this is a pretty long video, so I kind of want to jump into it as soon as possible. But with that being said, if you guys want to just be kept up with anything new regarding patch 11.2 and the war within, especially when it comes to some of the guides we'll be doing for the seasonal update, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. And if you enjoy regular updates, give this video a like as well. But with that being said, let's dive right in. So Death Knight is by no surprise a very popular pick. It was really good season 1, really good season 2. So it's not surprising that it was actually surprisingly, like, ridiculously overwhelmingly popular in season 3. However, it looks like Blizzard has noticed Death Knights and then trying to nerf them in all ways they can, primarily focusing what looks like on Frost and Unholy while giving Blood some love. Finally, Deathbringer ends up kind of taking over for Frost for the most part, so they're doing some targeted nerfs for Deathbringer in particular, just slight adjustments here and there. With the exact Wave of Souls, for example, the critical strikes of this effect will now increase your Shadow Frost damage by 3% instead of 5%, like a slight reduction, but nothing crazy, although like with all the other changes, it does kind of cascade all together. With Swift and Painful, you will now increase your strain by 5% instead of 10% for 8 seconds if you don't strike multiple targets with the Wave of Souls, and the actual damage of Wave of Souls is now not going to be 100% more effective on your priority target, but rather 50%, so another slight single target reduction there. Also, Exterminate, the first Scythe effect is actually being nerfed by 15%, so even more reductions for Deathbringer overall. This will also be impactful because technically Deathbringer is going to get more uses out of Scythes, more procs of Exterminate through its tier set, so you're reducing quite a decent bit of that damage that a lot of Death Knights saw early on. Outside of this, Frost DK, all ability damage nerfed by 3%, which is nothing crazy, Obliterate damage nerfed by 5%, and we were seeing Death Knights going into what looks like a two-handed playstyle with big Oblit damage all across the board, so it looks like that they're doing some reductions there as well. For Unholy Death Knights, it looks like they're primarily targeting Sunland to make sure that Rider actually gets some viability this time around. So there are some nodes on Sunland that are being nerfed a little bit, specifically for the spec of Unholy. Like Frenzied Bloodthirst, for example, is going to increase the damage of a Death Coil by 4% per stack instead of 8%. But also the tier set 2 set bonus will now extend your Virulent Plague by 3 seconds instead of 4 seconds, which is going to impact the 4 set, which is now going to increase the damage of Affliction of Sorrow. Instead of by 35%, it is 30%. So all of these changes are kind of like compounding as they build off of each other, and you're nerfing all the different elements that tie together nicely. Lastly, Death Knight Death Coil damage is also being nerfed by 20%, so it is just a slight nerf adjustments here and there that may potentially get him playing outside of Sunland, but we'll see exactly the impact of the changes as we get closer to the release of the Season 3. And like I said, Blood are finally getting a little bit of a leg up, and that's primarily through the Bow and Shield mechanic. With the Bow and Shields, you'll now be able to increase your armor by 115% of your strength instead of by 100% of your strength, which does mean more armor, which does mean better survivability against pure physical damage, which is going to increase the Blood Death Knight survivability overall ever so slightly. It's overall a good change to see, especially for a tank that I don't see that often when it comes to dungeon testing. It's no surprise the Demon Hunter continues to do really well over in the PTR, and I would say arguably one of the more popular specs that I see a lot when it comes to dungeon testing, outside of like people testing out Prop Paladin. But with Vengeance, they are trying to reduce some of their effectiveness before the season approaches. Specifically through the talent of Deflecting Spikes, it is a very slight reduction, but they're reducing their parry chance from 10% to 8%. Nothing crazy. It is technically going to impact their overall survivability a little bit. I think that's what they were trying to do, but I could see more tuning and adjustments coming out in the future. Then we got a couple of buffs that will help Feral Druids out in particular, starting with Wildstalker with the Creeping Vines, the Vigorous Creeper's talent, which technically works for Resta, but also for Feral. The Feral can get a lot more value out of it. Vigorous Creepers, the bleeds from the Bloodseeker Vines actually make the target take more damage for every single vine. And with the tiers, you can actually control how many vines you can put up on a target, 14 vines, which is great in single target situations. They're increasing the amount of damage amp that this provides from a 5% per vine stack to a 6, which is a slight increase. And like I said, with the tiers that they're getting right now, just pressing things like your Tiger's Fury causes Bloodseeker vines to grow on 3 valid targets. In pure single target, you're looking at 3 stacks on a priority target that you could use during peak burst cooldowns, which is really good. Sabertooth also further helps amplify this playstyle even further, because when you bite, you'll actually deal more damage with the dot effects per comp point that you invested, and that effect, the damage amp from dots, is being increased from 3% per comp point spent to 5% per comp point spent. So this actually feeds back into the Wildstalker and its bleed-based gameplay. As a class evoker, they're nerfing their tier set if you play the Flame Shaper playstyle, which is a lot of fun, and it's getting a tier set that doesn't necessarily like interact with them too much, but it does give them pretty powerful damage proc. When you press the ability of Engulf, you get a buff of Inner Flame, which buffs up the effectiveness of your dots, but also increases your chance to generate Essence Burst. Whenever you consume Essence Burst while the buff is active, you launch a Essence Bomb at the target, which does quite a decent bit of arcane damage to all targets. They're reducing that damage by 30%, I think, to try to make sure that there's a bit of balance between Flame Shaper and Scale Commander going forward. And the Hunter curse continues, as hunters for a number of expansions and patches when it comes to PTR builds, usually they'll start out really excellent, actually quite strong over in the PTR, competitive some would say, and then Blizzard tends to nerf Hunter right before it comes out to live, or like 1 week after Heroic Week of Raids or Mythic Week or whatever it is. Something about Blizzard, they just love keeping Hunters down. It looks like they're continuing that going forward, starting with Marksmanship. As a Marksmanship Dark Ranger, they're nerfing the damage of your Black Arrow by 8% for Marksmanship only. But you may think that, oh well, at least I have Sentinel. Even Sentinel doesn't come out unscathed here. The Sentinel 2 set, they're actually changing a little bit, where it will increase the damage of your arcane shots during Boon of Elune buff, which is basically whenever a Lunar Storm is active. That damage is going to be reduced from 20% increase to aim shots down to 10%. So yet another nerf for Marksmanship in general, but we're not done there, as trick shots also get yet another nerf. Instead of cleaving targets for 75% normal damage, it'll now be reduced down to 60% of normal damage, so a considerable nerf when it comes to AoE output. For some of you, you may think that it's worth maybe escaping to Beast Mastery, because you want to still play Range Hunter, Marksman got nerfed, maybe Beast Mastery is coming out on top, but Beast Mastery continues to get even more nerfs, this time all damage reduced by 3%. However, this is one of those like additive nerfs where they've been reducing the damage of Beast Mastery over and over and over for multiple weeks. So this isn't just like, oh, just 3%, not that bad. You also got to add up to all the other nerfs they've done with it, because there's been like a couple of nerfs here, 5% here, 3% here, 5% here, 3% here, and all of these compound together to like, yeah, Beast Mastery is just continuing to get chipped down little by little, which is also unfortunate. And it looks like they're also keeping the class of Mage in check as well, starting with Sun Fury Hero Talent, which is the Phoenix build. Meteorite damage from Sun Fury is getting nerfed by 15%. The Meteor is what you get from the Glorious Incandescence, which actually is a decent bit of output for Sun Fury through a damage proc when you build your resources. But they're also nerfing the damage of the Phoenix itself, specifically with an AoE damage, and they're nerfing that by 10%, which makes Sun Fury in AoE, which has been getting traction in Mythic Plus for PTR, reduced a little bit in value. On top of it, Arcane Mages with AoE are also getting clipped a little bit with the talent of Resonance, which is now going to give you a damage amplification bonus of 12% rather than 15%, which is a slight nerf, but still is a nerf regardless. While Fire Mages are going to see all damage reduced by about 3%, which isn't that crazy, but also they're reducing the damage of Flame Strike by 15%. This is directly going to impact a playstyle of Fire Mage together with the Phoenix build. Whenever you get your capstone, you'll get, once the Phoenix fades, you get Hypothermia buff, where you can spam Pyroblast and Flame Strike over and over and over, which will continue to increase the damage of that Flame Strike by 15%. So there was a build where you could go for a big combustion build, drop Flame Strikes, then your combustion fades, Phoenix fades, and you continue to burst with Giga Flame Strikes. That is getting, that whole combo that was really effective in AoE is also getting taken back a little bit as well. Next we have the class of Monk, and this is going to be a change specifically targeting Conduit of Celestials. For Mistweavers, the fourth set of Celestial reads, basically the set itself empowers Heart of the Jade Serpent so you could proc it through other effects, but also the Heart of the Jade Serpent buff now increases your haste. They're reducing that from 15% down to 10% for the spec of Mistweaver Monk. Technically, that's also being reduced for Windwalker as well. The Windwalker gets a few other reductions also, where there are two set which can now proc Heart of the Jade Serpent from abilities such as Slice and Winds. That's now, instead of having an 8-second window, that's only going to have a 4-second window. So slight reductions there to try to give Windwalker a little bit more balance between Conduit and Shadow Pam. But on top of it though, Windwalker damage actually sees a buff. Where other classes see nerfs, Windwalker is still a little bit less represented. So they're trying to make sure they don't completely fall out of the meta by amping their damage by 8%, which is a sizable number of just overall damage gain all across the board, which is really good to see. From there we have the class of Paladin starting with Herald of the Sun for Holy, and they're doing a little bit of this like back and forth adjustment, some nerfs, but then some buffs afterwards. Things like Eternal Flame Healing is being amped up by 15%, which is really good to see. However, Sun's Avatar Healing proc works off of your wings, this one is getting nerfed by 40%, so quite a sizable decrease there. Dawnlight's Radiating Healing, which means Dawnlight is like a single target heal, but then a portion of its healing can radiate to nearby allies, or if it's a damaging dot, it can radiate to nearby enemies dealing damage. So they're reducing that radiate effect to 5% instead of 8%. But then we have the talent of Second Sunrise, which is actually getting a really cool change. Normally, Second Sunrise reads, Light of Dawn and Holy Shock have a 50% chance to be cast again at 30% effectiveness. They're changing it so now Light of Dawn and Holy Shock now have a guaranteed chance to be cast again. So you basically get 2 Light of Dawns and 2 Holy Shock for the price of 1. Holy Shocks, however, the second cast of Holy Shock will not build your holy power. So they're limiting how much resources you're able to generate out of it, but still you're getting 2 Holy Shocks, which is a lot of healing, or 2 Light of Dawns, which is a significant heal because Light of Dawn doesn't really see a lot of play, but with this change it may potentially do it. The additional cast, however, is not going to be cast at 30% effectiveness, but rather at 15% effectiveness. But this is still huge. It makes the playstyle a little bit more consistent, and now it actually gives you some interactivity with the ability of Light of Dawn, which for the longest time I've seen no play whatsoever, but being able to get a second cast of it, maybe it'll have just enough power, barely enough to be cast in some raid situations, potentially. Really hard to tell, but I think Light of Dawn is like the least usability in the Paladin kit, but it's got almost for a reason, because nobody really wants to be spamming Light of Dawn. They just have it there. You don't really see a lot of reasons to use it, and abilities like Word of Glory end up being far more effective in most cases. However, they're also going to be increasing the tier set for Holy as well, where they're buffing Downlight Healing from the tier set. Instead of increasing it by 30%, that's going to be increased by 60%. So that Dawnlight Radiation effect that they nerfed doesn't really impact it nearly as heavily. Also, the 4th set will now increase Holy Power spenders by 30% during Solo Wrath instead of 15%. And Solo Wrath is essentially a buff that you get after your Avenging Wrath wings fall off, and it'll last for about 10 seconds. So it basically is like another set of fake wings that will follow up real wings every time you use wings. When it comes to Red Paladins, we actually have a slight buff for Herald of the Sun with the Sunseer talent, where Sunseer damage is now being increased by 100%, which procs off of Hammer Wrath and Divine Storm critical strikes, causing the targets to burn for additional damage, which is kind of nice. Outside of this, Retribution is also getting buffed all across the board, from abilities like Divine Storm, buffed up by 10%, Wake of Ashes also further buffed up by 10%, Talent of Seething Flames buffed up by 20%, and the dot from Wake of Ashes called Truth's Wake also buffed up by 20%. So a solid bit of a buff that amplifies their AoE damage, but also usable in single target as well. From there we got the class of Rogue, which is actually getting some buffs, some nerfs as well, but primarily buffs all across the board. First of all, the talent of Cold Blood for Rogues will now have its cooldown start immediately as soon as you use it. And now the duration of this buff is going to be 15 seconds. This allows Cold Blood to start going on cooldown immediately from the get-go instead of just like freezing until you consume all the charges of Cold Blood. This is huge for a fade-bound playstyle of assassination in particular that can leverage this ability in a very unique way where Cold Blood can only be used up by your Invenoms. This allows you to use Cold Blood a little bit more aggressively so that all of your abilities can sync up together, and the cooldown of 45 seconds of Cold Blood can no longer be like delayed, or you have to do any kind of weird rotational changes in order to get the cooldown churning as early as possible. So this is overall a really good change that reduces the desync of cooldowns for assassination as fade-bound specifically. Outside of this, we got buffs for Deathstalker Assassination, which was kind of a mediocre tier set, but they're trying to amp it up. The true set is now going to increase the effectiveness of Deathstalker damage and effect whenever you shoot the target by 60% instead of 50%. And the 4 set increases the duration of Shiv by 3 seconds instead of 2 seconds, which prolongs the 2 set bonus. This is overall a decent bit of a change for a playstyle that is mostly passive and not super interactive, but it is a solid gain for Deathstalker Assassination. Pivoting a little bit to subtlety this time, while still staying on the topic of Deathstalker, while Assassination Deathstalker gets buffed up, for some reason Subtlety Deathstalker gets nerfed. Even though this playstyle isn't seeing a lot of play on PTR, isn't looking like a powerful option. Maybe this is a PvP specific change, but really who knows honestly. It was looking at Deathstalker Subtlety was really underperforming, but it looks like it's going to continue doing that same thing. The 2 set reads that it will now increase the effectiveness of Deathstalker damage effects by 40% instead of 50%, so that's a further reduction for that spec in particular. However, it looks like there was a bug where lingering ductless effect from Deathstalker wasn't really functioning properly, so now it does. So after Shadow Blades fades, you'll deal additional shadow damage, or you'll gain 30% increased shadow damage during the buff's duration. Which I guess is maybe an overall gain, but like in general, Deathstalker Subtlety wasn't looking like a really good option overall. Jumping back over to Fadebound, which technically affects Assassination and Outlaw in the same way, they're actually buffing it by a significant bit. The way the Fadebound playstyle works for the most part is whenever you consume enough common points for a finisher, you flip a coin. Either you get a buff called Heads, which increases your damage, or Tails, which deals immediate cosmic damage. And every time you use a finisher, you continue to flip a coin. Every time it lands on Heads, it increases the damage of that Heads buff by a little. And every time you land on Tails, it keeps increasing the Tails cosmic damage by 10% per stack. And you can actually track it as a buff within your stacks. They're actually buffing the damage of the coin flip Tails, as well as the Lucky Coin, which is a capstone thing, by 17%. This is a significant buff for Fadebound. This is a lot of damage by itself. Like this little buff right here is a huge amp for Fadebound in particular. They also fixed an interaction between Fadebound and Assassination 2 set bonus, where it actually would cause Kingsbane to lose some of his damage, but it no longer does, which is also a fairly big gain by itself. So both of these bug fixes does make Fadebound for Assassination and Outlaw very, very solid overall. The last hero spec we can take a look at is the Trickster, which is getting some nerfs for both Outlaw and Subtlety. For Outlaw is the buff of Nimble Flurry, which increases Blade Flurry cleave effectiveness by 25%, while Flawless Form is active, which is pretty much all the time. It is a little proc that you could pretty much maintain forever, honestly, if you play the class correctly. So with Nimble Flurry, they actually nerfing it from a 25% damage amp to a 20%, so it's a slight AoE reduction. Trickster Subtlety is also getting a slight nerf in the same way. Nimble Flurry cleave effect is also getting reduced from 65% down to 60%, which is not the craziest. However, Nimble Flurry cannot benefit from mechanics such as Shadow Blades. Previously, it wouldn't be able to. The way that Nimble Flurry works is your auto attacks like Backstab or your auto attack abilities as well as Backstab, Shadow Strike, and Eviscerate will now cleave on up to 7 additional nearby targets, so giving your single target abilities additional AoE output. But that AoE damage would be its own separate damage outputs or damage source, like in details. It would be just called Nimble Flurry. And Nimble Flurry could not benefit from things like Shadow Blades. While Shadow Blades is active, it not only causes your common point builders to build additional common points, but all damage and abilities to deal 20% additional damage. So, Nimble Flurry was not being affected by a damage amp. It was able to amplify the damage of your backstabs and such, but the actual damage of Nimble Flurry was not being impacted whatsoever. So now that this bug has been fixed, this is a significant buff for Subtlety in M+ situations, increasing the viability tenfold. Outside of all this, however, they've also done some tuning for rogue specs as well. Assassination, for example, is receiving a 4% damage buff on top of all these changes, though this damage amp will not apply for PvP. Outlaw Rogue is also receiving about a 3.5% damage amp, which is decent enough, but also the damage of Killing Spree goes up by 15%, which not only makes it better as a finisher, potentially usable as Fatebound, and much stronger when it comes to playing Trickster, which directly interacts with Killing Spree ability. Then of course we have Subtlety, which is also receiving a 5% damage amp, though like Assassination, this does not apply for PvP. Overall, putting rogues in a much better spot than they were, and addresses some of the core issues. There's still other things that we could talk about when it comes to rogues, and I don't really know if it's going to be enough to make them like super giga insane. I feel like this set of changes is good, but it's almost similar to like, you know, painting red flames on a race car to make it go faster. It is a good change overall, and it looks really good. I'm just not really sure if it's going to have like a huge impact when it comes to overall viability, but it does definitely help out rogues, which have been in a slightly dire situation for a good portion of the PTR. Finally, we have the spec of Warlock, or rather the class of Warlock, with Destruction, which has been the one that's been adjusted the most this time around. First of all, Destruction Hellcaller with the damage, which is the dot damage, is being reduced by 15%, as well as the damage of Blackened Soul, which is like a more active effect as you send soul shards. While a Wither is active, it causes it to struck its human stacks, deal immediate damage, so both of those effects are being reduced a little bit. However, Destruction Warlock's Chaos Bolt damage is being buffed by 20%. This is overall a bit of more power given to Destruction baseline and a little bit power taken out of Hellcaller, and I think it is really done to try to see if it can figure out some sort of a balance between Diabolist and Hellcaller in a little bit of a different way. But with that being said, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Also, join our Discord community, especially if you just want to keep up with last minute changes for patch 11.2. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.